So welcome everyone to congratulations for making it to Hennings. We all made it. And for joining for this week's IRES seminar, which is co-sponsored by the Interdisciplinary Biodiversity Solutions Collaboratory, or IBioS. So thank you to IRES and to IBioS and everyone involved in both of those for making this happen. It is my pleasure. I'm Caitlin Gaynor, for those that don't know me. I'm an assistant professor here in zoology and botany. And it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Katie Fiorella, who is joining us from Cornell University, where she is an assistant professor in the Department of Public and Ecosystem Health. And Katie's work really spans interdisciplinary boundaries, is very solutions-oriented, drawing on public health and environmental science to understand the ways in which environmental change shapes human livelihoods, food security, and nutrition, with a focus on global fisheries. And I've had the pleasure to know Katie for a while now. We were graduate students together in the same lab at UC Berkeley, where we both completed our PhDs. And yeah, have been really privileged to have her as a collaborator and mentor and friend. And I hope you all join me in welcoming Katie to UBC.
Thank you so much, Caitlin. Okay, well, it's so nice to be here with you all today. Today, I'm going to talk about environmental change in Cambodia's social-ecological food systems. And I wanted to just say ahead of time that this work is really in partnership with Khmer communities and the Center for Khmer Studies and World Fish. So a lot of the research I'll be presenting today is a collaboration between Cornell students, Cambodian students, and researchers, and myself. So to give the big picture of some of these dynamics that we're going to talk about today, it won't come as a surprise to this group, but there have been these really dramatic recent declines in biodiversity. And what this graph made by WWF really shows is that declining freshwater biodiversity pulls down our global decline in biodiversity estimates. So freshwaters are beset by a range of challenges that are, of course, affecting other ecosystems, and the results have been particularly dramatic and alarming. And this alarm is because of the importance of biodiversity intrinsically, of course, but also because of the really critical and direct role that freshwaters play in energy production, in sustaining food production through irrigation and through fisheries, which is where I'll really focus in today. So what are some of these negative forces affecting freshwater biodiversity? So dams are playing a really acute role in reshaping ecosystems. Many fish are migratory. Their life cycles involve movement across ecosystems, from the egg to larval to juvenile adult stages. So migration through riverine systems really acutely affected by dams, for example. So regions like Cambodia that are at the base of the Mekong River, very acutely affected by these kinds of things, right? And so the purple dots here are all operational or being constructed dams, and the tan ones are all planned, right? So really a staggering number of different energy production needs dovetailing with what's going on with these ecosystems. Pressure on these ecosystems also comes from a range of different longstanding dynamics. Pollution, depicted here from the nutrient pollution in Lake Victoria, causing harmful algal blooms and all sorts of other effluents to enter freshwaters and impact the ecosystems and the organisms that we eat from them. Invasive species, this is the Nile perch, which is also introduced into Lake Victoria and has totally reshaped the ecosystem there, causing the extinction of some 300 native cichlid species. And of course, fishing pressure. So a lot of harvest pressure is ongoing in these ecosystems. They play a really important role in food systems. And then I also wanted to highlight the climate change dynamics. So these are images from the Great Lakes in the US, showing the thermotolerance of different fish species. And of course, as our waters warm, we're going to have a whole host of impacts that both affect the ecosystems and the fish in them, and also the behavior of people who are harvesting those fish, with a whole constellation of possible effects. And so at the same time that we're in the context of all of these threats, aquatic food consumption is growing. And so this graph shows aquatic food consumption over time, which is the gray line here. Oh, sorry, it's a little hard to see, but seafoods are down there. And this is alongside shifts in consumption of other animal source foods, most of which also are growing. And we're also more and more being encouraged to eat fish as a replacement for some of these other foods, which might have a greater environmental impact, especially in terms of its carbon emissions. So where is that fish going to come from? So filling that gap in consumption is going to require more and more fish production fish are going to need to be continually harvested from wild systems in really large quantities. So that's what's represented here in blue. But it's also going to come from aquaculture production, shown here in yellow. And so aquaculture is now half of global fish production. And as you can see in this graph, it's really rapidly expanding. It's a really recent growth to this extent. So it's experiencing the fastest growth of any food system segment, 7.5% per capita growth. And even with that growth, we're still going to need our wild ecosystems and the fish that they're producing for quite some time. You can see the wild fish production basically flat for the last 30 years or so. And in some ways, this is a good sign. We're harvesting fish at capacity, which means we're doing a good job of reaching maximum sustainable yield in a lot of fisheries. But it also means there's not much room for growth in that production. And any downturns could really impact aquatic food access, which is important for nutrition as well. So the other things to note about this, so the large majority of aquaculture production is in Asia, about 90%. Majority in China, also India, Indonesia, Vietnam, Bangladesh, Cambodia. And it's also predominantly coming from freshwater fisheries. So 62% of aquaculture production is freshwater production. And so as with other animal source foods, around the world, there are really big disparities in that consumption. So the line here is the global average. And these percentages are actually the share of the global average. So you can see like Asia has 70% of the share of fish consumption. But what I really want you to notice about this graph is the share that is yellow, which is freshwater fish consumption. So I think we often think about a lot of our aquatic foods as originating from our oceans, our seas, but a lot of it's also coming from freshwaters. And so it's not the quantity of fish only that matters here, it's also the biodiversity of those fish and the nutrients that they provide. And so it's more and more becoming clear that amongst this whole spectrum of diverse aquatic foods, that there are really different levels of nutrients available from them. So this is a graph from a review where we looked at the nutrient composition of different fish species and show here that the quantity of recommended dietary allowance met by a serving of fish for these different fish species provides really dramatically different percentages of vitamin A. So for some of them, it's fully meeting people's needs. Other fish species, we use cod and salmon as sort of a benchmark here, not making a big contribution to those nutrients. And so for a long time, the availability of nutrient composition information has really been a major limiting factor in trying to understand this, but there have been more and more modeling efforts that have helped to fill in the gaps, right? So for fish species, we have hundreds of species of fish that are consumed, and it's really costly actually to analyze them for nutrient composition. But some new modeling techniques have really advanced the science and let us understand better what are the nutrient profiles of different fish across different trophic levels. And so the second set of graphs uses some of this modeling data and is a project led by Sebastian Halpern, who's a postdoc at Cornell, looking at two of the most biodiverse fishery systems in the world, the Amazon and the Tonle Sap. And what we're showing here is a principal component analysis of nutrients in fish. And essentially what you can see is that the dots representing individual fish species are scattered throughout this graph. So that means that the nutrients that they're a really good source of is pretty variable across these species. And there's also a lot of variation in the abundance of these fish, shown by the size of the dot, and their vulnerability, shown by the colors. So meaning which fish we're harvesting can have a really different impact on the species conservation concern and the nutrition of the harvest that it's yielding. Okay, so with that context in mind, where I really want to focus today is essentially at the dynamics in this photograph and how we understand the social ecological systems and interactions between people and these ecosystems to better characterize how threats to them and benefits from them interact with people's well-being. So this fisher is fishing in Cambodia's rice-field fisheries. He's throwing out his net, and the studies that I'm going to share today ask how the biodiversity in that system is providing for his family and well-being. So we asked fishers really directly how they see these fisheries and their future. And we also analyzed survey data that was collected with fishers in rice-field fisheries that I'll present today. And so all of this is really at this interface of social ecological systems. And that's a perspective that I try to take across these projects. Okay, so the first question here we'll ask is, how do fishing families value these fisheries and see the changes that are affecting them? And the second one is, how does biodiversity filter from the ecosystem to household catch, fish consumption, and fish sale? Okay, so the study site that we're focusing on is the floodplain of the Tonle Sap, and these 40 dots represent community fish refuges, which I'll tell you about in just a moment. But they're part of this constellation of rice field ecosystems that includes lakes and more permanent bodies of water, tributaries and streams, and connects to the main lake itself. Cambodia has the 5th highest inland fish harvest, and it has the highest per capita inland fish harvest. So people are withdrawing really large quantities of fish, and it's a big part of incomes and diets. Inland fishing households get upwards of 50% of their income and of their animal protein from fish. So let me show you what the lake pulse looks like on an annual basis. So this is the Tonle Sap Lake. This is the Mekong coming down here. And annually, it floods to about 5 times its size with the rainfall and the water from the lake. And so this seasonal flood pulse is really part of the fabric of the ecosystem and the fisheries that are in this system. And so in this floodplain area, the government of Cambodia demarcated community fish refuges, which were designed to conserve biodiversity, increase access to fish, and improve food security, and to provide for community-based management in these fisheries. And these were established and then supported by World Fish. So the establishment of them demarcated them, and some were in existing bodies of water, other were sort of essentially a location without even a body of water that stayed all year round. So a whole bunch of things were done to support them, both including the governance mechanisms and helping train communities on different ecosystem processes to actually like building with a digger the actual space where the reserve would happen, or connectivity between it and other parts of the ecosystem to really facilitate the flow of fish between this reserve and the rest of the ecosystem itself. And in this ecosystem, there are a really staggering diversity of fish. So 135 species documented in households catch and in the ecosystem, 2nd highest freshwater biodiversity in the world. And there's 3 sort of behavioral guilds of fish that are seen in the system. So they're named for the color of the water. So whitefish are long distance migrants that like swimming in the lake or the clear white water. Gray fish like swimming short distances. And the blackfish are sort of these resident fish that live on the floodplain. So these ones in the basket are some of the very hardy floodplain fish that can essentially move between water bodies. They can often make it relatively substantial distances to find the next piece of water. They're really tough. And so their escape from the basket sort of demonstrates this. And so with this system, we talked to people both who lived right next to the lake itself and fished in those waters, and also people that were part of these rice field fisheries. And so we wanted to really understand, how do fishing families value these fisheries and see changes that are affecting them? So what do people value about the fishery? What challenges does it face? And how do perceptions differ between men and women and across these different kinds of communities? And so to ask these questions, we used a photo voice methodology. And so working with the Center for Khmer Studies and students in Cambodia and at Cornell, we used this method, which is a participatory qualitative research method. And photo voice participants take photographs based on a prompt that we established together. In this case, it was, what is the story of fish diversity in your life? And so there's first a training of participants that's sort of a collective integration of sort of basic photography, how to use the cameras, and an establishment of what the question's going to be. And then we gave everyone a camera for 5 to 6 days, including weekdays and weekends, to take photographs of how they see this prompt in their life. And then did an interview with people based on the photographs they had taken. So they selected the photographs that they wanted to share, and then we asked them a couple of questions about it, asking for how would they title this photograph, and how would they How do they describe what's in it? And then what do they see that's behind the photograph that's not visually represented? And then we came together to do a focus group about the photographs too, and sort of the broad themes. So worked with 4 communities, 2 within the rice fields, 2 nearby Tonle Sap. When available, a man and woman in each household. And these are some of the photographs that folks take. And so one initial takeaway from the photos generated by this project was really the richness of biodiversity people are using in their lives. So I was really struck by just the sheer number of fish species in these photographs. And this very much relates to culinary tradition. So linking back to different segments of the ecosystem, people are harvesting different aquatic foods from, and you can see this whole range here. And I'll share a few examples of what participants shared about these photographs. So this person said, it represents our good health. We have energy. Fish have good vitamins. I feel happy when I get fish to cook as food for our everyday life. And this individual said, the biodiversity surrounding my community provides me enough variety of fish to support our livelihood. Therefore, we don't have to buy food from outside sources. People also really highlighted a whole range of challenges that they face and some solutions in this sector too. So this photograph, which I think is this really beautiful depiction of someone's child looking at this fish catch, what the individual actually said about this photo was, we caught only a small quantity of fish. I'm upset when I think about making a living from this. The fish that I caught don't even fill up the container. It only is filling up the bottom of the container. Likewise, someone sharing, it's difficult for me to think about what kind of food to make when the fish is so little because we live close to the lake and used to eat bigger fish. Now that we got only a small quantity of fish and we had to sell some to earn money, it was very difficult. If we don't buy vegetables to cook with the fish, the food won't be enough. And conversely, we also had, in asking about fish, we also had a lot of people share totally different elements of their livelihood, which I thought was a really striking element of sort of how they thought about their fisheries and the future of them. So this person said, I love this picture because this year I grew a good amount of rice. I didn't catch anything because the water level in the rice fields is too low after I harvested the rice. And this person said, I've seen them conserving fish here and I want them to continue. And so the second quote there is really this reference to the community fish refuges, which a lot of people talked about. I won't share more about it here, but we did some evaluation of the refuges and saw that there are really strong interannual fluctuations that really drive the biomass and biodiversity in them. So it's hard to isolate any activities that the CFR committees and governance were doing that are influencing things beyond the site and annual fluctuations. But I think it's a really striking example of a community really being able to work within these fluctuations and still feeling a lot of value from having control over these refuges locally. And we also did some work with Naomi, thinking about the climate change impacts and how the annual fluctuations in climate change is affecting both fishers' behavior and the fish populations themselves, which underscored a lot of those annual fluctuation dynamics. And so takeaways from some of this work is that there's a really uncertain future for freshwater ecosystems and foods. So people are representing this rich diversity of fish and other aquatic animals that they catch, diversity of meals and favorite dishes, but they feel a lot of worry about the challenges that they're facing, and particularly acutely in the communities that were really reliant on fisheries as compared to the ones that had more of a diversity of options. Some of these key challenges were the declining fish catch, seasonality, illegal fishing, which sort of a combination of both what the government definition of legal fishing was and what people's perceptions of what was problematic for the ecosystem was. So there's a lot of fuzziness between whether something was technically illegal or whether it was something that they perceived as problematic, highlighting this conflict between some of the more industrialized and small-scale fishing. And this quote, I think, really underlines that too, which is, I want the government to make sure there is no illegal fishing because we have a reduction of fish. Because they use big equipment to fish, that's why we don't catch a lot of fish. My net is laid in one place, their net is used to chase the fish all the time. I'm afraid it can never get better. If the government is really good, they'll find a way to prohibit the use of bigger fishing equipment. So I think this story of diversity and the importance of it to people in their lives is really juxtaposed with this like pretty dire situation that a lot of fishers are highlighting working in this system. And so this work really prompted us to think about this question of, in this system where there's a lot of environmental change, but there is still also a really rich biodiversity of fish, how is the biodiversity benefiting households and how are they able to make use of it? And so this next question is, how does biodiversity filter from the ecosystem to household catch, fish consumption, and fish sale? And so why do we want to know about how this sort of filters through the system? So biodiversity loss is happening at this staggering scale, often driven by food production itself. But also the diversity of wild foods accessed is really critical to dietary diversity in diet. So the diversity of food groups in your diet has been really closely linked to nutritional outcomes. This is this measure of dietary diversity, thinking about across food groups like eggs, grains. So this is an established nutritional measure. But the biodiversity within food groups has also been linked to improved nutritional adequacy of diets. So yet how access to biodiverse natural resources translates to increased household use of that biodiversity to meet food and income needs is often pretty unclear. We do have a lot of evidence from agricultural settings that's asked this question, particularly about household plots and what the impact of more diverse production is. So when you grow more diverse agricultural crops, how does that affect the dietary diversity of what you consume? And it's generally found that for people well connected to markets, it has pretty little impact. So what people plant has a pretty small impact on what they consume if they're well connected and trading that food. Whereas for people that have poor market access, it can have a larger impact. But these dynamics are really opaque actually in wild systems that provide a critical food source. They support much higher numbers of species compared to agricultural settings, and they're experiencing really rapid declines in biodiversity. And the other big point here is that when we don't have detailed information about what households are doing, we often use commercial species, meaning those that are traded in markets, to be the sort of metric of both what is harvested and what is consumed. And so, for example, FAO tracks 20 species in Cambodia, but of course we know this is a big simplification of what is available in the ecosystem and what people consume. I think I showed you pictures of more than 20 species just a minute ago. And so as we think about this, thinking about sort of how we can better get a sense of what these harvests actually look like. So the first question is, what is the relationship between biodiversity and the ecosystem and the biodiversity and household catch? Of course, households are also making decisions about what to target in this process. And the second one here is how does that biodiversity and catch translate to consumption and sale of biodiversity? Then we looked at the ecological traits of fish to see how these differ across the ecosystem, catch and consumption and sale. And finally, we looked at how household characteristics affect these relationships. So for example, do households that live closer to cities with more market access have a different strength of relationship here? So the map in the corner shows those community fish refuge sites again. And we use them as the ecosystem. So these are unfished sites that represent the ecosystem biodiversity. And then household data was collected by World Fish and its partners with about 20 households around each community fish refuge over 3 years. And so they looked at fishing effort, distance to markets, household size, dependency share, which is the ratio of younger and older adults to working age adults, education, household amenities and household assets, which are sort of income and well-being or economic well-being measures. And then we captured ecological traits from fish base, from using a nutrient density index and creating a commonness index based on the availability of species in our data. Okay, so the first relationship here that we look at is essentially that on average, across the different time points, household biodiversity is about 45% of the species available in the regional ecosystem. So the catch of what people's catch is 45% of what was available in the ecosystem. They're consuming almost all of the biodiversity that they catch, 43%, and they're selling a relatively tiny fraction of it, selling about 9% of it. So what you're looking at here is a simple box plot of the species richness across the community fish refuges. So these are the 40 refuges. This is our ecosystem metric. And the color is coded from the highest species richness in yellow to the lowest one in dark blue. So we retain these colors through the next box plots. So you can track the CFRs linked to each household. So we add in this plot of species richness of fish catch, and we can see that some of the lighter colors are up here, and that these relationships are also statistically significant. And this is also the relationship through a scatter plot too, so you can see sort of how there's some variability in this relationship. The relationship between caught and consumed species is incredibly tight, so really almost a one-to-one correspondence here. And then the relationship between caught and sold fish is also actually statistically significant, but it's this much lower proportion of what's available in the ecosystem still. Okay, so building from that, we'll take a look at what is actually the ecological traits associated with these different species portfolios that are caught, consumed, and sold. And so again, households are making decisions about this, right? They're choosing where to lay their nets, in which ecosystem, what types of fishing gear to use, and that affects what they catch. And then of course they're deciding what to consume or sell from that catch too. So using the same type of plots, we're looking at mean body size, nutrient density score, and commonness index here in these graphs. And so we found that ecological traits are associated with how biodiversity flows from the ecosystem to what households consume and sell. So on average, households are selling species that are larger, more common, and they consume species that are more nutrient dense. The larger species are disproportionately represented in sold species portfolios, which is pretty expected. And they, of course, tend to fetch higher prices, right? So that is probably, the high price is probably driven by a different set of preferences, but very much driving people's decisions to sell, right? And so the consumed species on average, though, are more nutritious, closer to the nutritional value available in the ecosystem. And much of that's driven by the relatively high nutritional value of small fish. So because people are selling the larger, more valuable fish, they're consuming the smaller, more nutrient-dense fish as well. And so we'll next look at these household characteristics that shape these relationships. So we first wanted to understand if it's really household characteristics that are driving the relationships between ecosystem biodiversity and catch biodiversity. So in other words, is this a function of what's available in the ecosystem, or is that really just driven by household characteristics, and that relationship will go away when we add in household characteristics, like distance to markets or wealth? So to get at that, we're looking at models that have no controls of household characteristics and then adding in different controls to the model. So here we're looking at the relationship between the species caught and the species in the ecosystem. And so when we add in our different household controls, we can see that the coefficient for that relationship is really quite stable. So this is including income, market access, and effort in harvest. And then when we look at the relationship between what's available in the ecosystem and the consumption of species and sold species, these relationships are also quite consistent. And so that gives us a fair amount of confidence that there really is something to what's available in the environment and how that's driving what households are actually accessing. The other thing that we do find here is a significant relationship between household assets, a measure of wealth, and biodiversity use, such that poorer households are harvesting and consuming more species. So this regional biodiversity really shapes household uses of biodiversity. Households are consuming an average of 43% of the species present in the regional ecosystem and selling only 9% of it. And available species in the ecosystem has this really consistent effect across households, which was really surprising to us, actually. So these households are really able to make use of the biodiversity in the system. And I think this is in sort of interesting contrast to some of the agricultural findings, where often it's an effort to get people to expand the crops that they're using, whereas this is like a much more culturally relevant set of foods that people have been using for a really long period of time. So that may be something at play in the strength of these relationships. And then understanding how biodiversity is used is really critical to appreciating its value. So open question here as to whether these relationships are similar across settings. Like, this is a very uniquely biodiverse fishery. So one of the things I'm really curious about is the extent to which this would hold in other places. But I think really points to the food and nutritional value of fish, and that's a critical piece in weighing other competing demands. And I hope an aspect that we'll be able to think about in sort of more more accurate terms as we think about the actual value that people are getting from these systems and these harvests, which are often sort of invisible. So I'll come back to this picture where we started with and leave you with the thought that these freshwater ecosystems facing a challenge across a whole bunch of constellation of factors. And this is very much true around the world and across ecosystems, of course. But they're also really integral parts of our global food systems. They supply wild foods and often tend to be supplying them to some of the most vulnerable people around the world. And so I think in a much bigger picture sense, we sort of stand on like the precipice of what's in this picture, that the global decision about the fate of fisheries and freshwater ecosystems hangs in the balance. But I think the scale of dependence is actually also really a strength and a reason for hope and opportunities for managing the fisheries that will provide for the longevity of these social ecological systems. So with that, thank you all very much for your time and attention. I want to thank the funders and partners of this work, of course.
Hey, thanks for the great talk. I was just trying to understand a little bit of this drop off of the top biodiversity and 42% of biodiversity system.
Mm-hmm.
Not in a couple of possibilities. Is it number one that like each kind of fish or farmer, they're only in a particular place and they're small, and so they're not getting all available, or is it that like combine across all the fish or farmers and put them all together and still only have 43% because they're selecting different?
Yeah, that's a great question. So across all of the different, repeat the question. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, good point. Yeah, so the question was really what's going on with the drop off from 100% biodiversity in the ecosystem to households using only 43% of it. So that's a great question. And so the 43% is an average across a whole bunch of time points, so 19 different time points. And so and across all of the data, almost all of the species are caught at least once by one household. But I do think on average, people are making some selection when they go out to fish, right? Like some fish are more desirable for taste and like ease of preparation and what have you. So and a lot of the methods people use to fish are just incredibly specialized. So like a very specific kind of trap that you stick in a channel to catch eels. Right. So if you put that trap out, right, you're making a choice about what you're hoping to get. So I think people do have a lot of ability to sort of manipulate the system, and I think probably it's true that not all species, just because they're in the ecosystem, are equally desirable for consumption. But also they all do at some point appear in people's catch and diets too. Yeah.
Like whether if you have long for time series data, you can look at response to like whether there's changes in what people select in the year and things. But I don't know if you imagine how long this but effectively you said all of the things that you have sunlight and
Yeah, that's a really good question. So and that question was about like the longer time series of response diversity to how the different species might be changing over time. Yeah, and I think that's a really good question. So this time series was 3 years. So it's somewhat limited, but there is potentially follow-up data that we've been chatting further about whether we could look at that over time. I think that is a really really interesting question. And seasonally, there are a lot of dynamics in this system too that is on our list for things to really investigate further here too. Mm-hmm.
Thanks for that very nice talk. Two, a naive question: is it generally assumed that smaller fish are more nutritional? Two, are you surprised by the relationship between catch and
Yeah, so those questions were about the relationship between fish size and nutrition, and about the relationship between catch and consumption. So the relationship between fish size and nutrition is an interesting one, and I think a lot of it is driven by the micronutrient richness of small fish, and a lot of the reason small fish are more micronutrient rich is because we eat the bones and the heads of them. And so because we're consuming them whole, they offer like a meaningful dose of calcium. And for a while, we also thought that small fish didn't have very meaningful quantities of omega-3 fatty acids. And that also tends not to always be the case. So some of them really are offering a fair amount of fatty acids and this like set of micronutrients that are really important. And that does seem to be a relationship that seems relatively true around the world, but there are also fish that are sort of exceptional and like they offer a really high quantity of certain nutrients. Salmon are actually touted as one of these really sort of nutritionally beneficial fish that is a little bit anomalous and in that too. But I think it's sort of this confluence of how people eat them. But the other thing that is important there is that small fish can be sold in small quantities. So it also means that different groups of people tend to have access to them. And they're also relatively easier. There's sort of this tension between like fleshier fish is easier to feed to kids potentially, but small fish you can grind and add to lots of foods like porridges. So you can sometimes, the nutritional benefits and whose diets they wind up in, small fish tend to wind up more in women and children's diets too. So that also means there's sort of more benefit to that. But then the second question was about like the extent of the relationship between catch and consumption. And I was a little bit surprised by that. I didn't think it would be quite that strong. I think like we expected the filtering basically in this direction, but didn't really know what the quantity at the different levels might be. So I think an interesting question is sort of whether it holds. Like it's quite possible that in the rice field fisheries, this is how it looks, but for communities fishing along the Mekong, it's different. And at this point, I really don't know, but yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. So this question was about the share and the sharing and other avenues that fish might go through. I think the other big one is processing, actually, that people process a lot of this catch into fish products. So we did have a little bit of data on processing, but it got a little tricky because so a pretty small proportion, so people basically were asked to allocate the proportion of their catch to different fish species and then asked, for this fish species, what proportion did you sell, consume, or process? And so the amount processed was actually pretty low. And we didn't ultimately know then if they consumed it or they sold it once they had processed it. So we didn't include processing in this analysis. But the way that trading and sharing was included it was like the fish that you didn't consume in your household. So that was defined by the enumerators as this bigger bin to include that. But I think it's quite possible that it didn't like exactly in people's minds either too. So I think that is a bit of a fuzzy place, and there may be pieces of that we're not capturing here too. Yeah, do you think it's more likely that it comes out of the consumed bin? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so in these communities, it seems like mostly what they were doing was using. So some people were doing that commercially, like the production of prahok is like the fermented fish, and selling it either within their village or at markets. But a lot of it actually in the couple of seasons that we were out was those fish were getting diverted to aquaculture feed elsewhere. And so there wasn't very much of that catch that was being used locally. So that might be part of it. But yeah, and then the other thing that we had heard mostly about that was that people were doing the prahok production with fish that were sort of like slated for consumption, but then went bad, or like were not, or lower value, or they didn't get to. And so then they would ferment those. And so then we felt pretty confident that it wound up in the like consumption bucket in one sense or another. But yeah, but I think that's definitely a part of the system, and one we didn't capture very well here. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Hi, I was wondering, you know how well fish are able to other parts of the
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question was how WorldFish or others use this information. So it's kind of new. It's not actually published yet. It's in review. So so still sort of on the horizon from their perspective too, I think. But they're thinking a lot about how sort of the inland fisheries community in general, about like how can we understand and advocate for the value of these fisheries. And so I think this sort of goes to this bigger question of there are a lot of pressures on these fisheries, and there's a lot of tension between the fisheries folks standing up and the energy production folks saying, well, we're going to move forward with this dam, you know, hopefully your fish populations are okay. And so I think part of the challenge has been not necessarily seeing the scale at which people are using the fish. So the hope for me and them is certainly that this helps sort of the conversation and thinking about that. Mm-hmm.
Could you talk a little bit more about the role of aquaculture in this region?
Yeah, that's a great question. So about the role of aquaculture in this region. So it's sort of interesting because the aquaculture sort of exists on this continuum, and some people, like, there is some stocking in these rice field fisheries. It is on some like low intensive scale of aquaculture. They're very much like a cultivated landscape. So in some sense, you know, some people might consider this in some part of that continuum. And other people really think of these as wild fisheries, right, that are coming into agricultural landscape. So to some extent, it's sort of your conception of what exactly like is official aquaculture or not. And there's definitely aquaculture development in parts of Cambodia, though a lot of the aquaculture is in other regions, and North and China is a huge aquaculture producer. And so a lot of the fish that are being siphoned into sort of feed production has to do with that growing production. And so the feed conversion ratio is a very big a metric in aquaculture systems, and increasing the sustainability of aquaculture really depends on being able to drive that down. And it's been falling quite fast. It's really there have been really innovative and big improvements there, but the scale of aquaculture is still just increasing really fast. So that even if you're using a lower feed conversion ratio, you still need a lot of fish for that. And so it's commanding a lot of fish, but it's not super clear necessarily like how those fish flows look in a lot of systems. But I think there are also exciting innovations that will hopefully change that in other feed sources. But for right now, it's coming from other fisheries, and so some of the segments of these fisheries are feeding that as well. Mm-hmm.
So yeah, interesting to know the biodiversity can attach to the consumption. Are you thinking about kind of the next steps for health outcomes or other once people eat the fish, then what is that?
Yeah. So the question sort of when people eat this fish, then what does it mean for their health? So there's sort of this tension, I think, between the fact that we're more and more appreciating the quantity of nutrients that are coming out of fisheries and into the diets of people who largely like live very close to fisheries. And then there's often like sort of a move inward and move to more urban areas, especially of small dried fish, things that sort of transport better. But a lot of intensity of consumption is in these fishing communities. And these also tend to be communities that don't have the highest levels of nutrition. So this is sometimes both a really important part of their diet and maybe also not fully meeting needs. So that's there has been more and more work thinking about, well, like who, you know, really getting to more of the intra-household dynamics and cross-community dynamics of sort of who is actually consuming it and what are the nutritional implications. Some of that's very like bioavailability of the different nutrients and different fish species, and getting more into that biochemistry pieces, and others are really thinking more on the like sociological side of sort of what food options, and so like I mentioned before, like the small fish are actually hard for little kids to eat, right? So how do you make those things more accessible? And there's a really interesting example actually from Cambodia that Save the Children, an organization that thinks a lot about malnutrition, and they've been, and traditionally acute malnutrition is treated with what's called plumpy nut. It's essentially like a fortified peanut butter. It's like peanut butter with a lot of sugar and whey protein. It's pretty tasty. And they like give these sachets out to kids. But Save the Children has been putting together a dried fish version of this essentially that could both be produced locally and has a nutritional profile that could be beneficial. So that's, you know, somewhere in this, like, is that part of the food system or extra kind of supplementation? You know, what do we really want as the outcomes space? But yeah.
So in the beginning, you motivated some of the talk with the dams that have been built and are going to be built. So how do you think about that? And dams have its effect on diversity, which then maybe affects nutrition, but they also have these other pathways, nutrition through other economic development pathways.
Yeah. So the questions about sort of the dam construction and what the multiple pathways that could lead to are both on the fisheries and other economic development. And I think that's a really good question. And I don't think it's super clear what the implications will be. I mean, certainly there's a quote from one of the MPs of Cambodia that said, you know, we'll be lucky when we have reached a level of development that everyone has access to really great jobs and malls, and they can look at these fish in a museum. And so I think you know, that's like one extreme part of that view, right? But it's very much the goal of a lot of these fishing communities to be in a more secure situation where they've reached a higher level of development and feel more economically secure. And so I think that is a real tension that that the energy production is part of that development too. My sense is that for a long time, these fisheries are still going to need to be productive for a lot of people who aren't going to make it into the next generation of factories or what have you to sort of start to climb those economic development ladders in these countries. And so I think that's true in a lot of agricultural settings too, that the small scale producers, it can be really hard for them to catch on to those. And so there's a balance to providing both of those things. And so I think it's certainly true that economic development is driving nutritional improvements. Like all of the benefits that we've seen in reduced stunting have come by and large from China's economic development that's reduced these forms of chronic malnutrition. So I think that's really an interesting piece of it. But in the end, our ecosystems are really driving so much of our health and well-being. And there is this question of like, can we replace it with aquaculture? You know, if we really do away with some of these ecosystems, then we have an aquaculture system that's providing the same quantity of fish. So there's evidence from Bangladesh that shows that really rapid development of aquaculture and shifts to consumption of aquaculture species has actually led to people consuming more fish and less micronutrients. So I think there's a real hazard in assuming that we can sort of engineer our way out of it, of preserving the ecosystems at the same time. But it's a real tension, and I think certainly there are lots of pathways that feed people's nutritional benefits and improved outcomes for that are totally economic and would be probably better served by more energy production.
And thanks for the discussion. And before we close, I just want to note also CD's around for the rest of the day, and if people want to catch up, let me know. There's a couple of spots in the schedule. And also this evening, we're going to be having an IBioS sponsored dinner. This is their friend's house, and we also still have a few spots available for that. But get in touch with me with the dinner and if you want to join for that, just so I know how much we prefer. Yeah, we can continue the conversation today and beyond. And thank you again.
Thank you all.